Best acting performances of all time in movies. The best cinematic performances don't share some standard of craft or technique. What they have in common is a feeling of invention and discovery, of emotional depth and power, and a sense of self-consciousness regarding the idea and the art of the performance itself. They also reflect broader transformations in the art of cinema during their times. Such actors as Joan Crawford, Barbara Stanwyck, and Jimmy Stewart were already stars in the high studio era of the 1930s, but their work became more freely expressive, more galvanic in the post-war years when the studios lost their tight grip on production, and when a new generation of directors made their mark in that freer environment. The French New Wave, developing new techniques with a new generation of actors and crew, lifted layers of varnish from the art of acting to fill the screen with performances of jolting immediacy, spontaneity, and vulnerability. The film performances of the beginning of the 21st century are a product of the drastic transformations that have taken place in movie making in recent decades, as a new generation of directors, both in Hollywood and outside of it, has managed to invent modes of movie making capable of adapting to unprecedented crises in the industry. The competition from television, prestige or otherwise, the top-heavy expansion of blockbuster franchises, and the rise of streaming platforms have led to a decline in studio movie production. As a result, independent producers have grown significantly in prominence and power, and their financing has had a liberating effect on directors and by extension on actors. Working largely with modest budgets, yet occasionally with larger ones than studios would provide, filmmakers have been able to take greater risks and make more unusual films, and to develop new methods of performance with actors whose artistry closely fits their own. In this video, we're going to talk about the best movie scenes of all times. Jesse Eisenberg, The Social Network. In the role of Mark Zuckerberg as a Harvard man-boy bringing Facebook to fruition, Eisenberg was so good and so apt at playing an asshole, the script's word not mine, that he became instantly the John Wayne of assholishness. Reminder, Wayne wasn't a real-life cowboy. Eisenberg conveys the wonder of the emotionally stunted genius's mental power and blank determination, pulling the movie out of the realm of satire and suggesting something strange and true about the vision behind the blind course of history. Whether Eisenberg has another kind of character in him is irrelevant. What matters is whether he has the filmmakers to pursue the kinds of subjects that make use of his distinctive art. Jafar Panahi, Taxi. When the Iranian director Jafar Panahi, a supporter of the country's political opposition, was given the draconian sentence in 2010 of a 20-year ban on filmmaking and placed under house arrest, he nonetheless continued to make films, now clandestinely and in isolation. In the most accomplished and complex of them, Taxi from 2015, he isolates himself within the confines of a car and portrays himself as a cab driver in Tehran, though his fares are staged meeting with friends, associates and family, with his camera fixed to the dashboard in the guise of a security measure. In his calmly passionate skepticism, wide-ranging curiosity, and cinema-centric imagination, he both plays and embodies the principled defiance of a reasonable and practical artist thrust by circumstances into radical action. With a definitive existential daring, as he reveals in his urban journeys, the ambient pressure and open threats that the regime poses to its subjects' freedom and safety, his presence and his performance as himself in a guise that he had never thought, plays like a fusion of Hitchcock and Solzhenitsyn. Kristen Wiig, Welcome to Me. The spirit of Jerry Lewis hovers over the modern cinema. His guilelessness, goodwill that veers ineluctably into catastrophe offers a model of surprisingly tragic complexity for an era that values innocence. Wiig's comedic art captures that spirit, joining a tone of lightness and purity to raging psychological turmoil. In Welcome to Me, the story of a woman who's obsessed with infomercials, with one in particular, and manages to become the star of her own public access program, Wiig blithely reveals and dramatizes her lifetime of pain and frustration, as well as her fantasies of redemption. Kim Min-hee, On the Beach at Night Alone. A new kind of acting for a new kind of movie. In the careful composed, yet conspicuously spontaneous dramas of the South Korean director Hong Sang-soo, Kim is both forceful and breezy, lyrical and emotionally scourging. In this film, which is inspired by a real-life public scandal resulting from Kim and Hwang's romantic relationship, Kim presents the painful tangle of love, friendship, and professional relationships with pugnacious and confrontational assertions that seem wrenched from deep within. It's a performance of compact power and terrifying vulnerability. Tiffany Haddish, Girls Trip. The comedic revelation launched by Judd Apatow unleashed a generation of great improvisers and pushed lesser ones to the fore as well. Among the greatest of them is Tiffany Haddish, who, in Girls Trip, virtually bursts through the screen. Her performance gives the impression that she's speaking her mind with a candor that seems continuous with life off-screen. That's why she's even more of an intrinsic dramatic actor than most comedians. And they all are. See The Kitchen. Where most comedians, even improvising, appear to create a persona, Haddish imbues her work with the force of her own experience. If the 17-minute speech that she gave at the New York Film Critics Circle banquet in 2018 had been released as a film, it would have made my list too. Both it and her performance in Girls Trip are great as they are, only hint at the power of her inventive imagination. Sandy Tan, Shirkers. One of the lost treasures of film history came back like a phantom in Shirkers, Tan's documentary about the making and vanishing of an independent feature that she'd co-conceived, co-written, co-produced and starred in her native Singapore during the summer she turned 19. The film within a film is a science fiction fantasy of inspired whimsy that's also in itself a personal documentary about the Singapore of Tan's own experience and passion, and the teen age Tan's performance in it, quizzical and puckish, fearless and tender, is matched by the investigative, reminiscent, searching and self-searching presence of Tan today, who more than 20 years after that shoot pursues the mystery of her film's disappearance, and the man, the original film's director, who stole it. Bill Murray, Lost in Translation. The Murray Renaissance began last century, with Rushmore, but Sofia Coppola added a crucial twist. In effect, she turned a pain on a pivot and rendered him both transparent and reflective. Part of the trick came from depicting him in the role of an actor, and part from eliciting from Murray a tampered down and pensive effect. Alienated from his life and his art, his character Bob Harris becomes an abyss in search of a standpoint and in the process defines irony out of existence. His pain and his quest are inseparable from his suave detachment, even if their points of connection are invisible to the eye. He embodies in Coppola's view the pathos, the poignancy and the danger of a man of the world who breezes through it frictionlessly. Delroy Lindo, The Five Bloods. The adjective Shakespearean gets thrown around whenever passion finds lofty rhetorical fervor, but Lindo's performance in Spike Lee's film does what a great performance of Shakespeare does. It both brings a majestic text to life and opens a new dimension of imaginative insight. Playing a Vietnam veteran who's a pent-up tangle of trauma and rage, Lindo attains a screen-shattering level of intensity. He confronts life and death, love and hate, crimes of history and personal failings, by means of explosive physical energy and a roaring buzzsaw-edged declamation. Along the way, he gathers in and bursts apart an entire history of war films and takes on the legacy of violence that they represent and perpetuate. Eddie Murphy, Norbit. The quality of comedy is proved physiologically with laughter, and Murphy's uninhibited inspiration sparks more of it here, in me at least, than in any new film of the century. But part of his disinhibition is psychodramatic, playing multiple roles. Murphy unleashes with a sense of painful revelation a tangle of rage, cringing fear, furious power and a sense of perpetual and unresolved outsiderness. Some claim that his roles in the film have indulged offensive stereotypes, but his caricatures seem to relate not to any real people, but to Murphy's own inner demons. Astonishment at his comedic craft is inseparable from astonishment at his confessional vulnerability. His performance was so extreme and so exposed that it gave the sense he could hardly go further, perhaps as part of why his career since then has been in a holding pattern. Daniel Kaluuya, Get Out. In Jordan Peele's horror film, playing a young black man who appears to be at home nowhere and an outsider everywhere, the dramatic paradox of independent mindedness. Kaluuya has captured the existential strangeness of a character whose physical surroundings come unmoored as his very identity is metaphysically alienated. With a muscular presence and an expression that begins with foreboding, shifts to disbelief, and devolves into shock, he seems to let his very being turn diaphanous. Peele's subject is the dawning of monstrous knowledge of the racist depredation lurking beneath liberal culture. He captures it through cinematic devices as laser-sharp point-of-view shots, and in close-ups and in action, Kaluuya conveys the horror of consciousness itself in the consciousness of horror. Joe Pesci, the Irishman. One of the odd things about a list of performances is that some of the most memorable ones are supporting roles, involving actors who dominated despite being on screen for only a small fraction of a movie's running time. Though the title of Scorsese's film refers to the main character, played by Robert De Niro, whose performance is indeed among the best of his career, both the protagonist's actions and De Niro's performances are, in effect, conducted by the mob boss Russell Bufalino, played by Pesci, in a performance of such calm and decisive authority that it virtually defines the nature of power. There's a silent moment in the film that's one of the greatest in the history of cinema, in which De Niro, facing the camera, glances at Pesci and then into the camera. Like the rest of the film, that moment is dominated not only by Pesci's still, ferociously controlled presence, but by his voice, even when he's not speaking. Leonardo DiCaprio, the Wolf of Wall Street. DiCaprio is the most paradoxical of actors. A star since he was a teenager, he built his career around his charisma and his gift for mimicry. In most of his early performances, he seemed to be impersonating a movie star, and slipped frictionlessly into his roles as they were costumes, regardless of the physical difficulty they involved. With The Wolf of Wall Street, he finally achieved his cinematic apotheosis. In the role of Jordan Belfort, a super salesman and super conman whose hedonistic will to power is one with his consuming fury, DiCaprio seemed to tap deep into himself, even if in the way of mere fantasy and exuberant disinhibition. He so heartily embraced the role's excesses that they stuck to him. He flung himself so hard at its artifacts that he shattered them and came through as more himself than he had ever been on screen. He and his art finally met. Adam Sandler, Uncut Gems. Sandler is by nature a performer in two tempi at once. Beneath the phlegmatic, sardonic lag of his speech and gestures, the wheels are spinning at overdrive in his mind. In the Safdie brothers film, the wheels turned faster than ever, and he overheated himself to keep up with his own compulsive calculations and frenetic scheming. It made for a performance of jangling, tangy excitement, the most innovative and original one Sandler has given, just after that of Funny People, both of which serve as reproaches to Paul Thomas Anderson's pallid, deflavorized use of him in Punch Drunk Love.